I was on a long haul, heading down I-90 through South Dakota. It was late October and the weather had just started turning cold. The wind was cutting, and the sky was overcast with that dull gray color that makes you feel like it could start snowing at any moment. The load I was hauling was bound for Spokane, Washington, and I had a tight schedule to keep. The sun was setting, and I knew I needed to make it past Rapid City before stopping for the night. I've been a trucker for nearly 20 years, and while the road can get lonely, I usually enjoy the solitude. There's something about the hum of the engine, the steady whir of the tires on the pavement, and the vast stretches of open road that can be oddly comforting. But that day, something just felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I tried to shake it off and focus on the drive. As I passed through Rapid City, I noticed the traffic was unusually light, even for that time of evening. Normally, you'd still see a few cars and trucks on the road, but it was practically deserted. It wasn't until I passed the exit for Deadwood that I realized just how alone I was. The sky had gone completely dark, and the only light came from my headlights and the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse. The road ahead stretched on into the blackness, and there wasn't another vehicle in sight. I decided to keep pushing on. I was making good time, and I figured I could make it to Gillette, Wyoming before needing to stop. I was running low on coffee, and I knew there was a truck stop in Gillette where I could refuel and get something to eat. The stretch between Rapid City and Gillette is pretty remote, just miles and miles of nothing but open plains and the occasional small town. It's easy to zone out on that stretch, but I kept my focus on the road. A couple hours passed, and I was getting close to the Wyoming state line when my CB radio crackled to life. It startled me because I hadn't heard a peep from it in hours. I didn't catch what was said at first, just some static and a garbled voice. I grabbed the mic and asked for a repeat, but there was nothing. Just more static. I figured it was just someone out of range, maybe another trucker up ahead. I let it go and kept driving. A little while later, I noticed a light in the distance. At first, I thought it was just the headlights of another vehicle coming toward me. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't moving. It was a single, bright light off to the side of the road. I slowed down as I approached, curious but cautious. As I got closer, I saw that it was an old RV, parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights on. The thing looked ancient, rusted out and covered in grime, with a busted-out tail light and a flat tire. I didn't see anyone around, so I pulled over to see if they needed help. It's not unusual to come across someone who's broken down in the middle of nowhere, and I always try to lend a hand if I can. I grabbed my flashlight and hopped out of the cab. The wind was howling, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath in the air as I approached the RV. The door to the RV was slightly ajar, and it was swinging back and forth in the wind. I called out to see if anyone was inside, but there was no answer. I stepped up to the door and pushed it open a little wider. The inside of the RV was dark, and it smelled like mildew and something else I couldn't quite place. It was the kind of smell that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I shined my flashlight inside, but it didn't do much good. The interior was a mess, clothes and trash strewn everywhere, and what looked like the remnants of a meal left on the tiny kitchen table. There was no sign of anyone, though. Just an empty, dark RV in the middle of nowhere. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but this was different. There was a feeling of unease that I couldn't shake. I decided it was best to get back to my truck and keep moving. Whatever was going on here, I didn't want to be a part of it. I started back toward my truck, but as I turned around, I noticed something off to the side of the road. It was another vehicle, a van, maybe a few hundred yards away, pulled off into the ditch. The headlights were off, and it looked like it had been there for a while. The windows were fogged up, and the car was covered in a thin layer of dirt and grime. I hadn't noticed it when I first pulled over, and that fact alone made me uneasy. I walked over to the car and shined my flashlight inside. The back seat was full of junk, old blankets, fast food wrappers, and empty soda bottles. The front seat, though, was what caught my attention. There was a purse sitting on the passenger seat, and next to it was a phone, its screen cracked and covered in dust. I leaned in closer and noticed the keys were still in the ignition. That was when I heard it, a faint noise coming from the back seat. It was so quiet I almost missed it. But it was there. I froze, my flashlight trained on the back seat, trying to see if there was something, or someone, back there. I didn't see anything, but the noise came again, this time a little louder. It sounded like a muffled cry or whimper, like someone was trying to call for help, but couldn't quite get the words out. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct in my body was telling me to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't just walk away if someone was in trouble. I took a deep breath and reached for the door handle, but as soon as I touched it, the noise stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand on the door, listening. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind and the distant rumble of my truck's engine. I pulled my hand away and backed up, not sure what to do. Part of me wanted to open the door and see what was inside, but another part of me knew that whatever was going on here, it was bad news. I decided to call it in. I walked back to my truck, climbed into the cab, and grabbed my phone. I dialed 911 and waited for the dispatcher to pick up. As I waited, I glanced back at the car and the RV. They were just sitting there, dark and silent, like they were waiting for something. The dispatcher finally answered, and I explained what I had found. She took down my location and said she would send someone out to check on it. I felt a little better knowing help was on the way, but I wasn't about to stick around. I started up my truck and pulled back onto the road, eager to put some distance between me and whatever was going on back there. As I drove, I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see headlights following me, but there was nothing. Just the empty road behind me, stretching out into the darkness. I kept driving, trying to shake the feeling that I had just narrowly avoided something terrible. I made it to Gillette a couple of hours later and pulled into the truck stop. The place was almost empty, just a couple of other trucks parked at the far end of the lot. I grabbed a coffee and some food, but I couldn't stop thinking about that RV and the car. I kept replaying the scene in my head, wondering if I should have done more, if I should have opened that car door, or if I had just made the right call by leaving when I did. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed in my cab, listening to the sounds of the truck stop, trying to push the thoughts out of my head. When morning came, I checked the news, hoping to find something, anything, that would tell me what had happened back there. But there was nothing. No reports of missing people, no police activity, nothing. I hit the road again, but that day the miles seemed longer, the road emptier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, even though I knew it was just my imagination. Every time I passed another car or truck, I found myself looking at the driver, wondering if they had seen something too, if they knew something I didn't. The rest of the trip was uneventful. I made my delivery in Spokane and picked up another load for the return trip. But the whole time I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened on that stretch of I-90. I've driven that route dozens of times since then, but I always find myself gripping the wheel a little tighter when I get to that stretch between Rapid City and Gillette. I never found out what happened with that RV or the car in the ditch. I checked the news a few times after that, but there was never anything about it. No missing persons reports, no police investigations, nothing. It's like whatever happened out there just vanished into the night. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm out on the road late at night with nothing but the hum of the engine and the dark highway ahead of me. There are places out there where the road seems to stretch on forever, where you can drive for hours without seeing another soul. And in those places, you start to realize just how big and empty the world can be. You start to realize that out there in the middle of nowhere, anything can happen, and no one would ever know. I was hauling a load of machinery parts from Houston, Texas, up to Kansas City, Missouri. It was late December, just a couple of days before Christmas, and the weather was bitterly cold. The roads were mostly clear, but there were patches of ice here and there, making the drive a little more tense than usual. I'm used to winter driving, but this trip felt different right from the start. I left Houston in the early morning, hoping to get as much daylight driving done as possible. The first part of the trip was uneventful, just long stretches of highway, the usual stops for fuel and coffee, and the occasional call home to check in with the family. My plan was to make it to Oklahoma City by evening, where I'd find a truck stop to spend the night before continuing the next day. As I got closer to the Texas-Oklahoma border, the traffic started thinning out. It's a pretty empty stretch of road, especially in winter, with miles of nothing but open fields and the occasional farmhouse. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape, and the temperature was dropping fast. I kept the heat cranked up in the cab, but it didn't do much to chase away the chill that was settling in. I crossed into Oklahoma just as night fell. The highway was nearly empty, with only the occasional car or truck passing by. I flipped on my high beams to cut through the darkness, watching the white lines on the road blur together as I pushed on toward Oklahoma City. About an hour into Oklahoma, I noticed a set of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first I didn't think much of it, just another vehicle on the road. But the lights were coming up fast. Too fast considering the icy patches on the road. I kept my eye on the mirrors as the vehicle approached, wondering if they were going to slow down or if I was about to get tailgated. The car sped up until it was right on my bumper, its headlights glaring in my mirrors. I could tell it was some kind of pickup truck, but I couldn't make out much more than that. I figured they were just impatient and would pass me, but they didn't. Instead, they stayed right on my tail, the headlights almost blinding me every time I glanced at the mirror. I tried slowing down, thinking they might pass if I let them, but they just slowed down with me staying inches from my rear bumper. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but they matched my speed, never pulling ahead or falling back. It was like they were locked onto me, and I couldn't figure out why. I've had my share of aggressive drivers over the years, but this was different. There was something about the way they were driving that set me on edge. It wasn't just impatience or someone in a hurry, it felt more deliberate, like they were doing it on purpose. But why? I didn't know. After a few more miles of this, I started getting really nervous. The road was dark, and there weren't many other vehicles around. I hadn't seen an exit or a rest stop in a while, and the next town was still a good distance away. I tried to stay calm, focusing on the road ahead, but the car behind me wasn't making it easy. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the car swerved into the left lane and pulled up beside me. I glanced over, trying to get a look at the driver, but the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see anything inside. The car paced me for a few seconds, then shot ahead, cutting back into my lane so close I had to hit the brakes to avoid a collision. I laid on the horn, but the car just sped up, pulling away until its taillights were just tiny red dots in the distance. I watched as they disappeared over a hill, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept driving, trying to shake off the tension, but something about the whole encounter didn't sit right with me. I figured that was the end of it, but a few minutes later I saw those same headlights again, this time up ahead. The car had pulled off to the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing. As I got closer, I saw it was the same pickup truck that had been tailing me. It was sitting there, idling on the shoulder just a few feet from the road. I slowed down as I passed, trying to get a better look. But again, I couldn't see anything through the tinted windows. The car just sat there like it was waiting for something. I kept driving, but I couldn't help glancing in the mirrors, half expecting them to pull out and follow me again. A few miles down the road, I saw another vehicle's headlights up ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a pickup truck, parked on the shoulder with its lights off. I figured it might have broken down, but as I passed, I saw the same thing. Dark, tinted windows, no sign of anyone inside. The truck didn't move, just sat there in the dark, and I started to feel that same sense of unease creeping over me. I drove on, more alert now, scanning the road for any more vehicles. The highway was still mostly empty, just long stretches of darkness and the occasional patch of ice glinting in my headlights. Then, just as I was starting to think I'd left the strange cars behind, I saw something up ahead that made my blood run cold. Another car, this time parked across both lanes of the highway, blocking the entire road. Its headlights were off, but I could see the dark outline of the vehicle against the faint glow of the horizon. I hit the brakes, slowing down as I approached, trying to figure out what was going on. There was no way around it. The car was blocking both lanes, and the shoulder was too narrow to pass on either side. I came to a stop a few yards from the car, my headlights illuminating the back of it. It was another pickup truck, similar to the one that had been tailing me earlier, with the same dark-tinted windows. I sat there for a moment, wondering if I should get out and see what was going on, but something told me to stay in the cab. I waited, the engine idling, my eyes fixed on the car in front of me. I didn't see any movement, no sign of anyone getting out or coming toward me. The whole situation felt wrong, like it was some kind of setup, but I couldn't figure out what for. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I glanced over and saw another vehicle approaching from behind, its headlights off, moving slowly toward me. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was the same pickup truck I'd passed earlier, the one with the dark windows. It was creeping up behind me, blocking any chance I had of reversing out of there. I was trapped, with no way forward and no way back. I gripped the wheel, trying to figure out what to do. My mind was racing, every possible scenario flashing through my head. Were they trying to rob me? Carjack me? Or was it something worse? Before I could decide, the car in front of me suddenly turned its headlights on, flooding the road with bright light. At the same time, the pickup truck behind me did the same, its high beams reflecting off my mirrors and blinding me. I squinted against the glare, trying to see what was happening, but all I could see were the bright lights and the dark shapes of the vehicles surrounding me. I didn't know what else to do, so I hit the horn, hoping to startle them, maybe get them to back off. But the sound just echoed through the empty night, swallowed up by the darkness. The vehicles didn't move, didn't react at all. They just sat there, engines idling, lights blazing. That's when I noticed something in the distance, behind the pickup truck. Another set of headlights coming up fast. My first thought was that it was another one of them, part of whatever was going on here. But as it got closer, I realized it was a big rig, barreling down the highway at full speed. I didn't know if the driver could see what was happening, if they even knew I was there. But I didn't have time to think. I slammed my hand on the horn again, this time holding it down, hoping the noise would catch their attention. The sound cut through the night, loud and desperate, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The big rig kept coming, and at the last second, the pickup truck behind me swerved onto the shoulder, barely avoiding a collision. The big rig roared past, its horn blaring, and the rush of wind rocked my truck as it sped by. The pickup truck in front of me jerked to the side, its headlights swerving as the driver tried to avoid getting hit. In the chaos, I saw my chance. I slammed the truck into gear and floored it, steering onto the shoulder and around the pickup truck, blocking the road. The tires slipped on the icy pavement, but I managed to keep control, swerving back onto the highway and gunning it down the road. I didn't look back. I just drove, my foot heavy on the gas, my eyes glued to the road ahead. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking on the wheel, but I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a town up ahead, the first real sign of civilization in miles. I pulled into a truck stop just outside Oklahoma City, my hands still trembling as I parked the rig. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down to make sense of what had just happened. I checked the mirrors, half expecting to see those vehicles pull in behind me. But there was nothing. Just the usual mix of cars and trucks coming and going, everyone going about their business like it was just another night. I got out, stretched my legs, and walked into the diner, trying to shake off the lingering fear. The place was warm and crowded, full of the usual truckers and travelers, and the normalcy of it all was almost surreal after what I'd just been through. I sat down at the counter, ordered a coffee, and tried to collect my thoughts. I didn't know what to make of the whole thing. Who were those people? What were they trying to do? And why had they singled me out? None of it made any sense. As I sipped my coffee, I overheard a couple of other truckers talking about a recent string of hijackings on the highways. How some drivers had been targeted by groups who would block the road and force them to stop. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Was that what had just happened to me? Had I narrowly escaped a hijacking? I didn't stick around to find out. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and got back on the road. I kept my eyes peeled the rest of the way, but I didn't see any more suspicious vehicles, and I made it to Kansas City without any further incidents. I never reported what happened. Part of me just wanted to put it behind me and move on. But I haven't forgotten it. Every time I'm out on the road, especially at night, I find myself checking the mirrors a little more often, watching for those headlights that might appear out of nowhere. I've had a few close calls in my years on the road, but nothing like that night in Oklahoma. It was a reminder that no matter how many miles you've driven, no matter how experienced you are, there's always something out there that can catch you off guard. I was hauling a load of lumber out of Eugene, Oregon, heading down to Los Angeles. The drive was a long one, mostly along I-5, which I've driven countless times before. It's a straight shot, but it can be a bit of a grind. Especially when you're doing it solo, the route takes you through some pretty remote areas, particularly when you get into Northern California, where the road winds through dense forests and small, isolated towns. It was mid-November and the weather was starting to turn. The forecast had mentioned a cold front moving in, and I could feel it in the air as I drove south. The temperature was dropping, and there were patches of fog that would roll in and out, making visibility tricky in some spots. But I was making good time, and I figured if I kept pushing I'd make it past Redding by late evening and find a place to park for the night. As I crossed into California and started winding my way through the mountains, the road started to get slick with a light mist that had settled in. The fog was thicker here too, and it felt like I was driving through a tunnel with only my headlights cutting through the gloom. There weren't many other vehicles on the road, just the occasional car or truck passing by in the opposite direction. It was one of those nights where you feel like you're the only person for miles. I was about an hour south of Mount Shasta, driving through one of the more remote stretches of the highway, when I noticed something up ahead. At first I thought it was just a patch of denser fog, but as I got closer, I realized it was smoke. My first thought was that it was a car fire, which isn't uncommon on these mountain roads, especially with the steep grades that can cause brakes to overheat. I slowed down as I approached, trying to get a better look. As I rounded a bend, I saw it, a pickup truck, off to the side of the road, fully engulfed in flames. The fire was intense, lighting up the surrounding trees and sending thick plumes of black smoke into the air. I pulled over to the shoulder, about 100 yards back, and grabbed my fire extinguisher. I didn't have much hope of putting out a fire that big, but I figured I could at least try to help if someone was trapped inside. I got out of the cab and started toward the burning truck, the heat from the flames already noticeable even from a distance. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. There was no one around. The driver's door was open and there were no signs of anyone inside or nearby. It didn't make sense. If the truck had caught fire while someone was driving it, they should have been nearby, either trying to put it out or flagging down help. But there was no one, just the burning truck in the middle of nowhere. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The fire was too far gone for my extinguisher to make a difference, and there was no cell service in this part of the mountains, so I couldn't call it in. I figured the best I could do was get back to my truck, drive until I got a signal and report the fire to the authorities. As I turned to head back, I caught a glimpse of something in the trees off to the side of the road. It was just a flash, a movement in the corner of my eye, but it was enough to make me stop. I shined my flashlight in the direction of the movement, but all I could see were the dark outlines of the trees, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I stood there for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and the distant hum of my truck's engine. I walked back to my truck, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was creeping over me. I've seen plenty of weird things on the road over the years, but there was something about this that just didn't sit right. As I climbed back into the cab, I kept my eyes on the trees, half expecting to see someone or something step out from the darkness. But there was nothing. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, glancing in my mirrors as I drove away. The fire was still burning, casting a flickering orange glow on the surrounding forest. I kept driving, my eyes on the road, but my mind was racing. Who had been driving that truck? And where had they gone? I drove for another half hour or so before I finally got a signal on my phone. I pulled over and called the fire in, giving them the location as best as I could remember. The dispatcher thanked me and said they'd send someone out to check it out. I hung up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a simple car fire. I pushed on through the night, making it past Redding and stopping at a rest area near Red Bluff. I was exhausted, but my mind was still buzzing with questions. I parked the truck, climbed into the sleeper, and tried to get some rest, but I couldn't stop thinking about that burning truck and the empty road. The next morning, I got up early and hit the road again. I checked the news on my phone, hoping to find some mention of the fire, but there was nothing. No reports of a truck fire, no accidents, nothing. It was like it had never happened. I continued my route down I-5, but the whole time I kept replaying the events of the night before in my head. The fire, the empty truck, the movement in the trees, it all seemed like something out of a bad dream. But I knew it had been real. I had seen it with my own eyes, smelled the smoke, felt the heat of the flames. It wasn't something I could just brush off. As I neared Sacramento, I decided to stop at a diner I knew just off the highway. I needed a break, and I figured a hot meal might help clear my head. The place was a typical trucker's stop. Nothing fancy, just good food and strong coffee. I sat at the counter and ordered breakfast, trying to focus on something normal for a change. The diner was mostly empty, just a couple of other truckers scattered around, keeping to themselves. As I waited for my food, I overheard a conversation between the waitress and one of the other drivers. He was talking about a car accident he'd seen a few miles back, how the car had gone off the road and down an embankment. The driver had been lucky, barely any injuries, just shaken up. The waitress nodded and mentioned how dangerous these mountain roads could be, especially at night. Then she said something that caught my attention. She mentioned how there had been a few incidents over the past year. Vehicles found abandoned on the side of the road, no sign of the drivers anywhere. She said it like it was just another fact of life out here, but it sent a chill down my spine. I finished my meal and got back on the road, but what the waitress had said stuck with me. Abandoned vehicles, no sign of the drivers, just like the truck I'd seen the night before. I couldn't help but wonder if there was some connection, if there was something going on out here that no one was talking about. I made it to Los Angeles later that day, dropped off my load, and picked up another one for the return trip. But the whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it was like a splinter that I couldn't get rid of. On the way back north, I decided to take a detour, to drive that same stretch of road where I'd seen the burning truck. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe some sign that someone had been there, that the fire had been reported and dealt with. But when I got to the spot, there was nothing. No sign of the truck, no burn marks on the pavement, nothing. It was like it had never happened. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out, walking to the spot where the truck had been. The air was crisp and cold, and the trees were silent. I stood there for a while, just staring at the empty road, trying to make sense of it all. But there was nothing, just the empty stretch of highway and the quiet forest surrounding it. I got back in my truck and drove away, feeling more unsettled than ever. I've driven that route many times since then, but I've never seen anything like it again. I still think about it, though, especially when I'm out on the road at night, driving through those remote stretches where you can go miles without seeing another soul. I've heard other truckers talk about strange things they've seen on the road, lights in the sky, figures standing by the side of the highway, even whole towns that seem to disappear when you get too close. I used to think it was just stories, things people tell to pass the time. But after what I saw that night, I'm not so sure anymore. I've been driving trucks for a good 20 years, and I've seen all kinds of strange things on the road. Most of it you learn to shrug off, just part of the job when you're out there for long stretches, especially at night. But there was one time a few years back that still sticks with me. It's not something I like to think about too often, but I figured it might help to write it down. I was on a run from Denver, Colorado down to Phoenix, Arizona. The load was a bunch of electronics, nothing special, just another haul to get from point A to point B. The route took me through some pretty isolated parts of Colorado and New Mexico before hitting the long, straight highways of Arizona. I'd done the trip before, so I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. I left Denver late in the afternoon, figuring I'd make it as far as Albuquerque before stopping for the night. The first few hours were easy, clear skies, good weather, and light traffic. I made good time, passing through Colorado Springs and then heading south toward the New Mexico border. It was one of those drives where everything just seems to go smoothly, and you start to relax into the rhythm of the road. But as I crossed into New Mexico, the sun started to set, and things got a little more challenging. The terrain out there is pretty rugged, with long stretches of empty road winding through desert and mountains. There aren't many towns, and the ones you do pass through are small and quiet, the kind of places where everything shuts down after dark. I knew I'd have to push through if I wanted to reach Albuquerque by a decent hour. The sky was clear, but it got dark fast. There's something about the desert at night that can feel pretty eerie, the way the landscape stretches out forever in every direction, with nothing but the stars above you. The road was empty too, which didn't help. I hadn't seen another car or truck in what felt like hours. It was around 9 p.m. when I passed through a tiny town called Vaughn. Not much there, just a few houses, a gas station, and a diner that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in days. I didn't need fuel, so I kept going, heading back out into the darkness. That's when things started to get weird. About 20 miles past Vaughn, I saw a car pulled off to the side of the road. It was an older model sedan, one of those boxy types from the late 80s or early 90s. The hood was up and the hazards were blinking, but there was no sign of anyone around. I slowed down as I approached, thinking I'd pull over and see if they needed help. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The car looked like it had been there for a while. The paint was faded and there was a thick layer of dust on the windows. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave their car out here in the middle of nowhere? And where were they? There wasn't anything for miles around, just empty desert and the occasional scrub brush. I pulled over a little ways ahead of the car and turned on my hazards. I grabbed my flashlight and got out, figuring I'd at least take a look. The night was quiet, except for the distant sound of coyotes howling somewhere out in the desert. The air was cold, and I could see my breath as I walked toward the car. The closer I got, the stranger it seemed. The car wasn't just old. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. The tires were flat, and the chrome was rusted in places. But the weirdest part was the driver's side door. It was open, hanging there like someone had just stepped out. I shined my flashlight inside, but the interior was empty. Just an old, torn-up seat and a dashboard covered in dust. There were no keys in the ignition, and the glove box was hanging open, its contents scattered across the floor. It looked like someone had gone through it in a hurry, searching for something. But there were no bags, no personal belongings, nothing to indicate who the car belonged to or where they might have gone. I stood there for a minute, feeling uneasy. I've seen plenty of abandoned vehicles over the years, but this one felt different. There was something off about the whole situation, like the car had been left there on purpose, but for what, I couldn't figure out. I decided it was best to get back on the road and put some distance between me and that car. I got back in the truck, pulled onto the highway, and kept driving, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But it wasn't long before I saw something else that made my stomach drop. About 10 miles down the road, there was another car, pulled off to the side just like the first one. This one was a little newer, maybe mid-90s, but it was in the same condition. Dusty, flat tires, driver's door open. I slowed down again, but I didn't stop this time. I just drove past, trying to get a look inside as I went by. It was the same story, empty, abandoned, like someone had left in a hurry and never come back. I couldn't figure it out. What were the odds of 2 abandoned cars, both in the middle of nowhere, both with the driver's door hanging open like that? I kept driving, the tension building with each mile. The road was still empty, no other vehicles in sight, just mile after mile of dark highway stretching out in front of me. I turned on the radio, hoping for some company, but all I got was static. I tried a few different stations, but there was nothing, just the occasional crackle of a distant signal that would fade out before I could catch anything. Then, just when I was starting to calm down, I saw a figure up ahead on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, just a dark shape standing there in the headlights. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't moving. It was just standing there, completely still, like it was waiting for something. I slowed down, my eyes locked on the figure, trying to make out any details. It was a man, wearing a long coat and a hat, his back turned to me. But he didn't react to my truck at all. Didn't turn around, didn't move an inch, just stood there like a statue. I drove past him slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. As I went by, I glanced in the mirror, half expecting to see him turn and look at me. But he didn't. He just stood there, fading into the darkness as I kept driving. I didn't stop again after that. I just kept going, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The highway seemed to stretch on forever, and the night felt darker than it had before, like the stars had disappeared and left me alone in the void. I finally made it to Albuquerque around midnight, pulling into a truck stop on the outskirts of the city. The place was brightly lit, with a few other trucks parked in the lot and a couple of drivers milling around, smoking or talking on their phones. I parked the rig, climbed out of the cab, and just stood there for a minute, letting the normalcy of the place wash over me. I went inside, grabbed a coffee, and found a booth where I could sit and clear my head. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. I wasn't even sure how to explain it. But the whole thing had left me rattled in a way I hadn't felt in years. After a while, I decided to call it a night and got a room at the motel next door. I didn't sleep much, though. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that car with the open door, or the figure on the side of the road just standing there, waiting for something. I kept telling myself it was just a strange coincidence, that there was nothing to it, but the more I thought about it, the less I believed it. The next morning I hit the road again, trying to put as much distance as I could between me and that stretch of highway. The drive through Arizona was uneventful, just long stretches of desert and the occasional small town. I made it to Phoenix without any more incidents, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I dropped off the load and picked up another one for the return trip, but I decided to take a different route back, one that would avoid that stretch of road in New Mexico. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of exactly, but I knew I didn't want to go through there again. I've done a lot of driving since then, but I've never forgotten that night. I've heard other truckers talk about strange things they've seen on the road, lights in the sky, ghost towns that aren't on any map, people who disappear without a trace. But what I saw that night was different. I was on a run from Portland, Oregon, down to San Francisco, hauling a load of industrial equipment. It's a route I've done plenty of times before, usually a straightforward drive along I-5 with no major issues. The weather was clear when I left, and I figured it'd be an easy trip, 2 days down, unload, and then head back up north. Nothing special. I left Portland in the late afternoon, thinking I'd drive through the evening and find a place to stop around the Oregon-California border. The first few hours went by without a hitch. Just me and the road, the sun setting over the mountains, and the occasional other truck or car passing by. Traffic was light, which was nice, and the miles were ticking away. As night fell, I started thinking about where I'd stop for the night. There's a truck stop I like near Ashland, right before you hit the California line. It's a good place. Decent food, clean showers, and usually a quiet lot where you can catch some sleep. I figured I'd make it there by around 9 or 10 p.m., depending on how the traffic was through the mountains. I was just starting to climb into the Siskiyou Mountains when things started to get a little weird. The road winds a lot through there, with plenty of sharp curves and steep grades, so I was focused on my driving. The trees are thick, the road is narrow, and it's easy to lose sight of the sky as you wind your way up. The headlights cut through the darkness, but beyond that it was just shadows and the occasional glint of moonlight on the guardrails. About halfway up the mountain, I noticed a car behind me. Just a single set of headlights in the distance. It wasn't unusual. Sometimes you'll get a car or two that stays behind a truck for a while, especially on those winding roads where it's tough to pass. I didn't think much of it and kept driving, keeping an eye on the mirrors now and then. But as I kept climbing, I realized the car was getting closer, faster than I expected. The road was narrow, and I was taking it slow to handle the curves safely, but this car was gaining on me, almost like it was in a hurry to catch up. I figured they'd pass me once we hit a straight stretch, but when I glanced in the mirror again, the car was right on my bumper, its headlights glaring in the mirrors. It was odd, but I've seen aggressive drivers before, so I tried not to let it get to me. I kept my speed steady, waiting for a place where the road would open up enough for them to pass. But instead of passing, the car just stayed there, practically on top of me. The headlights were so close they were almost blinding, making it hard to see the road ahead. I tried slowing down a bit, hoping they'd take the hint and pass, but they just matched my speed, sticking to my bumper like glue. It was starting to get to me, being tailgated like that, especially on a dark mountain road, isn't just annoying, it's dangerous. I was keeping my eyes on the road, but every few seconds, I'd check the mirror, expecting them to make their move. But they didn't. Finally, I hit a stretch of road that straightened out a bit, and I thought this was it. They'd pass me and be on their way. But instead, the car swerved slightly, coming up alongside me on the left. I glanced over, trying to get a look at the driver, but the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see a thing inside. The car paced me for a few seconds, then suddenly sped up, cutting in front of me so close that I had to brake hard to avoid hitting them. I hit the horn, but the car just sped up, disappearing into the darkness ahead. I was rattled, my heart racing from the close call. It was a dangerous move, and I couldn't understand why they'd do something like that. There was no one else on the road. No reason to rush like that, especially not on a mountain pass. I kept driving, trying to shake off the adrenaline. But a few minutes later, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. Up ahead, maybe a quarter mile or so, was the same car, pulled off to the side of the road. The headlights were off, but I could see the silhouette of the vehicle against the moonlit trees. I slowed down as I approached, trying to figure out what they were doing. Had they broken down? Were they waiting for someone? I passed the car slowly, glancing over to see if I could get a look inside, but it was empty. No driver, no passengers, just the car sitting there with the door slightly ajar. The whole scene felt wrong, like something out of a bad movie. I sped up again, putting some distance between me and the car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I continued up the mountain, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights behind me again. But there was nothing, just the dark road and the trees closing in on either side. I started to relax a little, telling myself it was just some jerk driver playing games, or maybe they really had broken down and were waiting for help. I was about 10 miles from the truck stop when I saw something else that made my blood run cold. There on the side of the road was another car, an old model car with its hazard lights flashing. I slowed down thinking maybe someone needed help, but as I got closer I saw it was the same car I'd passed earlier, the one that had been tailgating me. It was unmistakable. I didn't stop this time. I just drove past, keeping my eyes on the road, but I couldn't help glancing in the mirrors again. The car was still there, its hazards blinking in the darkness, but there was no sign of the driver. I kept going, trying to push the image out of my mind, but the unease was growing stronger by the minute. I finally made it to the truck stop, pulling into the lot and parking near the back where it was quieter. The place was almost empty, just a couple of other trucks and a few cars parked under the lights. I got out, stretching my legs and trying to shake off the tension that had been building during the drive. As I walked toward the diner, I glanced around, half expecting to see that car somewhere in the lot, but there was no sign of it. I went inside, ordered a coffee, and sat down at the counter, trying to clear my head. The place was quiet, just a couple of other drivers sitting in booths talking quietly over their meals. The normalcy of it all was reassuring, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After a while, I paid the bill and headed back to the truck, figuring I'd catch a few hours of sleep before getting back on the road. But as I walked across the lot, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There, parked at the edge of the lot, was the same car, its headlights off, but the door still slightly open. I felt a surge of panic, my heart pounding in my chest as I stood there, unsure of what to do. The lot was quiet, no one around, just the faint hum of the truck stop in the background. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the sight of that car just sitting there, so close, was too much. I decided to move the truck, finding a spot closer to the entrance, where there were more lights and more people around. I parked, locked the doors, and climbed into the sleeper, pulling the curtains shut and trying to block out everything that had happened. But sleep didn't come easy. Every sound, every creak of the truck had me on edge, thinking about that car and whoever or whatever was driving it. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew it was early morning, the first light of dawn creeping in through the edges of the curtains. I got up, stretched, and peeked outside. The lot was starting to fill up with other trucks, drivers getting ready to hit the road. I glanced around, looking for that car, but it was gone. No sign of it anywhere. I felt a mix of relief and lingering unease as I got ready to leave. Maybe it was all just a weird coincidence. Some local playing pranks or a driver who'd had a few too many drinks. But it didn't feel like that. It felt more deliberate, like whoever was in that car had been watching me, waiting for something. I finished the drive to San Francisco without any more incidents, but the whole time I kept thinking about that car, the driver I never saw, and the strange feeling that had settled over me during the night. I made the delivery, picked up my next load, and headed back up north, taking a different route this time, sticking to the main highways where there were more cars, more lights, and more people around. I haven't taken that mountain pass since. I've done plenty of night drives, and I'm not one to get spooked easily. But something about that night stuck with me. It's like there are parts of the road that don't belong to us, places where you're not supposed to stop, not supposed to linger. I was on a long haul from Dallas, Texas, heading out to Salt Lake City, Utah. The route was one I'd taken a few times before, and it wasn't supposed to be anything out of the ordinary. Just another drive through the heart of the country, passing through small towns and stretches of open road. The load was simple. Construction materials, nothing particularly valuable or time-sensitive. I had a good amount of time to get there, so I wasn't in any rush. I left Dallas in the early morning hours just as the sky was starting to lighten. Traffic was light, and I made good time getting out of the city. The weather was decent, cool but not cold, with the promise of a clear day ahead. I figured it would be a straightforward drive, and I might even be able to take it easy, stopping at a few of my usual spots along the way. As the morning wore on, I crossed into Oklahoma, cruising along I-35. The landscape started to flatten out, the trees thinning as the road stretched ahead of me. It's the kind of drive where you can zone out a bit, just letting the miles slip by under your tires. I stopped at a truck stop near Oklahoma City, grabbed a coffee, and refueled before hitting the road again. Everything felt routine, just another day behind the wheel. By midday, I was well into the Oklahoma Panhandle, a long stretch of highway with not much around. The road was almost empty, just a few other trucks and the occasional car. The sky was a pale blue, stretching out forever, with hardly a cloud in sight. It was one of those days where the road seemed to go on endlessly, the horizon barely shifting as the hours passed. It was mid-afternoon when I decided to take a break. I was coming up on a small town called Boise City, one of those tiny dots on the map that you'd miss if you blinked. There was a truck stop there that I'd used a few times before, a good place to stretch my legs and grab a bite to eat. I pulled off the highway and rolled into the lot, parking near the back where it was quieter. The place was mostly empty, just a couple of other trucks and a few cars in the lot. I walked inside, ordered a sandwich, and took it back to the truck to eat. As I sat there, watching the occasional vehicle pass by on the highway, I noticed a man standing near the edge of the lot, just off to the side of the entrance. He was leaning against a beat-up old pickup, smoking a cigarette and watching the road. There wasn't anything particularly unusual about him. He looked like a typical local wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, with a ball cap pulled low over his eyes. But something about the way he was standing there caught my attention. He wasn't doing anything, just watching, like he was waiting for something. I figured he was probably just taking a break, same as me, so I didn't think too much of it at the time. After I finished my lunch, I got back in the truck and pulled out of the lot, heading back onto the highway. As I passed the entrance, I glanced over at the man again, and he was still standing there, watching the road. He didn't look at me, just kept his eyes on the horizon. I shrugged it off and got back on the highway, pushing it out of my mind. The road out of Boise City is long and straight, cutting through flat, open land with hardly any trees or buildings in sight. It's the kind of road where you can see for miles in every direction, with nothing but the occasional farmhouse or windmill breaking up the landscape. I settled into the drive, the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the tires on the pavement keeping me company. About an hour out of Boise City, I noticed something strange. Up ahead, maybe a mile or so down the road, there was a car pulled off to the side. As I got closer, I saw that it was an old van, sitting there with its hazard lights blinking. It wasn't unusual to see a car broken down on the highway, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. But something about it seemed off. I slowed down as I approached, trying to get a better look. The car was just sitting there, the driver's door open, but there was no one around. I glanced in my mirrors, wondering if the driver had gone for help. But the road was empty as far as I could see. I pulled over a little ways ahead of the car and stopped, grabbing my flashlight as I got out to see if anyone needed help. As I walked back toward the car, I noticed that the front end was smashed in, like it had hit something. The hood was crumpled, and one of the headlights was shattered. The driver's door was hanging open, but the interior was empty. No sign of the driver or any passengers. There were no footprints in the dirt, no tire tracks leading away from the car. It was just sitting there, abandoned. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but the only response was the sound of the wind rustling through the dry grass. I walked around the car, shining my flashlight into the shadows, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no clues about what might have happened. The car was just there, like it had been dropped out of the sky. I stood there for a minute, trying to figure out what to do. It didn't make any sense. Why would someone leave their car like this in the middle of nowhere? And where had they gone? I didn't have cell service out there, so I couldn't call it in. I figured the best thing to do was to get back on the road and report it at the next town. As I walked back to the truck, I felt a strange sense of unease. The road was empty, stretching out into the distance with no sign of life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and pulled back onto the highway, picking up speed as I put the car behind me. I drove for another hour or so, the sun starting to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. The landscape was still flat and empty, with nothing but fields and the occasional cluster of trees. I hadn't seen another vehicle in miles, and the only sounds were the steady drone of the engine and the soft hiss of the tires on the pavement. As the sun started to set, I noticed something up ahead. Another car sitting on the side of the road. This one was a little different. An old pickup truck, its hood up and its hazard lights flashing. As I got closer, I saw that the truck was in rough shape, covered in rust with a cracked windshield and a dented bumper. The driver's door was open, but there was no one inside. I slowed down as I passed, looking for any sign of the driver, but there was nothing, just the truck, sitting there like it had been abandoned. I kept going, the unease growing stronger as I put more distance between me and the truck. It was too much of a coincidence. 2 abandoned vehicles, both in the middle of nowhere with no sign of the drivers. I drove on, the sun sinking lower, the sky turning a deep shade of orange. The road seemed to stretch on forever, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the empty land. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see something behind me. But the road was empty, just the fading light and the long shadows stretching out across the fields. As night fell, the landscape became even more desolate. The sky was clear, the stars starting to come out, but there was no light on the ground. No towns, no houses, nothing but the occasional fence post or windmill silhouetted against the darkening sky. I turned on the headlights, the beams cutting through the growing darkness. But the unease was still there, gnawing at the back of my mind. About an hour after sunset, I saw another light up ahead. This time a pair of headlights, coming toward me on the highway. It was the first vehicle I'd seen in hours, and I felt a small surge of relief at the sight of it. As the car got closer, I realized it was moving fast, too fast for a 2-lane highway at night. I slowed down, gripping the wheel as I watched the headlights approach. The car sped past me, its headlights blinding in the darkness, and for a split second I caught a glimpse of the driver, a man wearing a ball cap, his face hidden in shadow. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. In the passenger seat, there was someone else. A woman, slumped over, her face turned toward the window. Her eyes were open, staring out into the night, and for a moment I thought she was looking right at me. The car disappeared into the darkness behind me, its taillights fading into the night. I kept driving, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The woman in the car. Something was wrong. She wasn't moving, and her eyes, they were so blank, so empty. I kept driving, trying to push the image out of my mind, but it was burned into my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened, that I'd just witnessed something I shouldn't have. The road seemed even darker now, the stars cold and distant in the sky. I didn't see any more vehicles after that, just mile after mile of empty highway. I reached the state line, crossing into Colorado, but the unease didn't go away. I finally pulled into a rest stop near the town of Lamar, my hands still trembling as I parked the truck. The place was quiet, just a couple of other trucks parked in the lot, their drivers asleep in their cabs. I got out, the cold night air biting at my skin as I walked to the restroom. The place was empty, the only sound the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I washed my face, trying to clear my head, but the image of the woman in the car wouldn't leave me. After a few minutes, I went back to the truck, locking the doors behind me as I climbed into the cab. I didn't feel safe out there, not after what I'd seen. I decided to push on, even though it was late. I just wanted to get away from that stretch of road to put as much distance between me and whatever had happened back there. I drove through the night, the highway stretching out endlessly in front of me. The landscape was dark and empty, the stars shining coldly overhead. I kept the radio on, hoping for some kind of distraction, but the static was the only thing that came through. The miles slipped by, but the unease never left me. By the time the sun started to rise, I was nearing the outskirts of Denver. The city's lights were a welcome sight, the first sign of civilization I'd seen in hours. I pulled into a truck stop on the edge of town, exhausted but relieved to be out of the darkness. I didn't sleep much that morning. Even with the sun up and the world bustling around me, the memory of that night wouldn't let me rest. I kept thinking about the abandoned cars, the man in the pickup, and the woman in the passenger seat, staring out into the night with those empty eyes. I finished the trip to Salt Lake City later that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there on that road. I've driven that route a few times since then, but I always stick to the main highways now. No more detours through the back roads. I don't know what I saw that night, and maybe it's better that way. There are things out on the highways that don't make sense, things that you're better off not knowing about. I've learned to trust my instincts, and when something doesn't feel right, it's usually best to keep driving. I was on a run from Chicago to Cheyenne, Wyoming, hauling a load of heavy equipment parts. It was a route I knew well, having driven it many times before. The Midwest, with its flat expanses and open skies, always made for a relatively easy drive, especially when compared to some of the mountain routes I've had to take over the years. The trip would take me through Iowa and Nebraska, and I planned to make good time, maybe even push through the night if everything went smoothly. I left Chicago early in the morning, just as the city was waking up. The traffic was light, and I managed to get out of the metropolitan area without too much delay. The weather was decent, cold but clear, typical for early December in that part of the country. The forecast had mentioned a chance of snow, but nothing serious until later in the week. I figured I'd be well past the worst of it by then. By the time I hit Iowa, the sun was up, and the day was shaping up to be pretty uneventful. I made my usual stops, fueling up, grabbing coffee, and checking in with dispatch. The road was straight and flat, just endless miles of farmland stretching out on either side of the highway. It's the kind of landscape that can lull you into a sense of calm, where the miles just slip away under your tires without you even noticing. I was making good time, cruising along I-80, when I decided to take a detour. I had been hearing about a shorter route that cut through some smaller highways, saving a bit of distance and avoiding some of the busier sections of the interstate. It wasn't a huge difference, but every minute counts on these long hauls, so I figured I'd give it a shot. The detour took me off I-80 and onto US 30, a 2-lane highway that wound through small towns and farmland. The traffic thinned out even more, and soon it felt like I was the only one on the road. The landscape didn't change much. Still miles of fields, punctuated by the occasional silo or farmhouse. The sky was overcast, and the temperature had dropped a bit, but the road was clear, and I was making good time. As the day wore on, the sky started to darken, and I realized I was going to be driving through the night. I didn't mind. I've always preferred night driving anyway. Less traffic, fewer distractions, just you and the road. I planned to stop at a truck stop in a town called Columbus, Nebraska, to grab some dinner and rest for a bit before continuing on to Cheyenne. I pulled into Columbus just as the last light of day was fading. The town was small, quieter than I expected, but the truck stop was well lit and busy with other drivers fueling up and grabbing a bite to eat. I parked the rig, stretched my legs, and headed inside. The diner was nothing fancy, but the food was good, hearty and filling, just what I needed to keep me going. After eating, I checked the weather again. There was still no sign of the snowstorm that was supposed to hit later in the week, so I decided to keep pushing on. I figured if I could get a few more hours in, I'd be close enough to Cheyenne to make an early morning delivery and still have time to catch some sleep afterward. I got back on the road, leaving Columbus behind as I headed west on US 30. The night had settled in fully by now, and the highway was almost deserted. The only light came from my headlights and the occasional distant glow from a farmhouse or small town. The road was straight and empty, just the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the pavement. About an hour out of Columbus, I noticed something odd. Up ahead, maybe a quarter mile or so, there was a faint light on the side of the road. It was hard to make out at first, just a dim, flickering glow that didn't seem to belong there. As I got closer, I realized it was a fire, a small one, maybe just a campfire or a controlled burn in a field. But as I approached, I saw that it wasn't in a field. It was right on the shoulder of the highway. I slowed down, trying to get a better look, and saw that it wasn't just a fire, it was a car, an old sedan, burning by the side of the road. The flames were low, almost as if the fire had just started, and the car was still mostly intact, though smoke was pouring out from under the hood. I pulled over a little ways back from the fire, grabbing my flashlight and fire extinguisher as I got out of the truck. The night air was freezing, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight as I walked toward the burning car. The road was silent, no other vehicles in sight, just the crackling of the flames and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the fields. As I got closer, I realized the car was empty. The driver's side door was open, and there was no one inside. The fire was small, concentrated under the hood, and I figured I might be able to put it out before it got worse. I used the extinguisher to douse the flames, managing to get it under control pretty quickly. Once the fire was out, I took a step back, trying to figure out what had happened. The car was in bad shape, old and battered, like it had been through a lot before it ended up here. The front end was crumpled, as if it had hit something and the windshield was shattered. But there was no sign of what it might have hit. No debris on the road, no skid marks, nothing. And there was no sign of the driver either. The only clue was a set of footprints leading away from the car, disappearing into the darkness of the fields beyond. I stood there for a minute, listening to the wind and the faint creaking of the car as it cooled down. The whole situation didn't make any sense. Why would someone abandon their car like this, in the middle of nowhere, and where had they gone? I decided to follow the footprints, just to see if I could find whoever had been driving the car. I grabbed a heavier jacket from the truck and set off into the fields, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as I walked. The ground was uneven, frozen in places, and the footprints were hard to follow, but I managed to keep on track for a little while. But after a few hundred yards, the footprints just stopped. There was no sign of anyone, no indication of where they might have gone. It was like they had just vanished into thin air. I stood there, turning in circles, trying to figure out what to do next. The field stretched out in every direction, endless rows of dead corn stalks rustling in the wind. I started back toward the road, deciding it was best to get back to the truck and call it in. But as I walked, I heard something, just a faint sound at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. I stopped, straining to hear it, and then I heard it again, closer this time. It was a voice, faint but clear, coming from somewhere out in the darkness. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. Just the sound of the wind and that faint voice, almost like it was calling for help. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I shined the flashlight around, trying to find the source of the voice, but there was nothing, just empty fields and the distant glow of the truck's headlights. I kept walking, following the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice got louder, more urgent, but I still couldn't see anything. It was like it was coming from all around me, echoing through the fields. I called out again, louder this time, but the only answer was the wind. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The night was silent again, the only sound my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. I stood there, flashlight beams sweeping over the rows of dead corn, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone, no movement, nothing but the cold and the dark. I turned and headed back to the truck, moving faster now, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I reached the road and climbed into the cab, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm down, but my hands were shaking and my heart was still racing. I grabbed the radio and called it in, reporting the abandoned car and the fire. The dispatcher said they'd send someone out to check on it, and I gave them the location as best I could. I didn't mention the voice or the footprints, just the basics. I figured it was better to keep it simple. After that, I got back on the road, eager to put some distance between me and that spot. The highway was still empty, and I drove with one eye on the mirrors, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But there was nothing, just the long dark road stretching out ahead of me. I made it to Cheyenne without any more incidents, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept thinking about that car and the footprints and the voice in the dark. I've heard stories about people getting lost in the fields out there, disappearing without a trace, but I always figured they were just that. Stories. I don't know what happened out there that night, and maybe it's better that I don't. All I know is that I won't be taking that detour again. There are plenty of other roads to drive, and plenty of other places to go.
Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.